Hi everybody, it's Stephen Brooke and welcome to my YouTube channel on architectural photography and composition. I want to go over photography that I did on Philip Johnson's glass house, which is one of the icons of modernist architecture. Usually I'm the first one on the job to photograph a project unless I'm working on historical projects, in which case lots of people have come before. But in particular, Philip Johnson's glass house has been photographed in dozens of books and dozens of articles and all. And so there was, for me, a unique challenge to try to set my work apart from everything that had gone on before. And I faced the same thing when I did my views of Rome. There were lots of people, including Piranesi, who had photographed Rome. And I decided that with my camera, I was going to set my own work apart. And that's a particular kind of challenge. So what I'd like to do is I would like to go over what was on my mind when I was actually doing the photography on Philip Johnson's glass house, what I thought about before I actually went and did the photos. And I think this will be interesting for you to see. It was interesting for me to put this together. So we've called this Philip Johnson's glass house, photographing a modern icon. I did this for a book on houses of Philip Johnson that I did for Abbeville Press with David Money and with Stover Jenkins. And what we did is we photographed 24 of Philip Johnson's houses, which of course included the glass house. There were a couple of things I wanted to make sure I was accomplishing, thinking about when I was doing the photography. The first is, Mr. Johnson was very concerned about the siting of his project. The landscape really was as important to him as the architecture itself. And he actually went and pruned out the backgrounds, and his siting was as meticulously crafted as the buildings themselves. There's the glass house, and then there are outbuildings as well. I also wanted to use a consistent proportional system in all of the photographs that would reflect Johnson's use of a very rigorous proportional system in his building. And when you do an analysis, you'll see that he relied on golden section proportioning. And you can go online and see some analyses of how his building was constructed, the length, the height, the width of the windows. All of that was precisely determined. And I wanted my photographs to have that consistency throughout, much like the great graphic designer Massimo Vignelli encourages the use of what's called a Swiss grid when you do a document, so that there is this underlying structure that's there. You may not be aware of it, but it determines where all of the elements go, where the type goes, where the photographs go, where everything goes. And there's this consistency throughout. And I wanted my photographs from beginning to end to have that same kind of consistency. And the last thing, I wanted to express wherever I could the transparency of the glass house, because that was so much a part of the design. I want to stop for a moment, and I want to look at Paul Cezanne, because Paul Cezanne, I have spent I don't know how many hours studying Paul Cezanne, and what he does, particularly with architecture in the landscape, informed a lot of what I was doing. So let's just take a look at a couple of things on Cezanne. One is that the architecture is always framed within the landscape. He's got trees over here, trees on the right, and it helps frame everything. There is an axial orientation, something that I have been talking about in a lot of the other videos. It gives stability, but the variations in tonality make it so that there's stability but without rigidity. And the landscape frames the building. Now, in absence of a vertical element, he has darkened the sky a little bit to frame the view. Notice that each facade in the architecture has its own tonality, which creates separation and volume. In the foreground, Cezanne always gives you a way in, and if you look at the tonality of the foreground, here's the lightest area off in the corner to bring you into the painting. Now, if you look here, I have this in a lighter red. There's a dark line that goes across, and turns the corner. Here's a dark line which brings you this way to the architecture. And then there's also this diagonal of the wall that also brings you towards the architecture. So the architecture and the landscape are conceived as one pictorial element, not here's the landscape, here's the architecture. This is very important for Philip Johnson's work because he was so careful about how he cited the glass house and all the other outbuildings. The other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to use a tonality that was markedly different from all the other color images that I had seen of Philip Johnson's glass house. I could look at and say, well, there's a Kodachrome shot, there's an Ektachrome 100 shot, there's an Ektachrome 200 shot, because film had, any kind of film, had its own almost stereotypical response to color. Because it's an organic emulsion, it was not as pliable, even with filters, as we have now with digital photography. So also I was using Claude Lorraine as my guide because I love not just his use of verticals and how he composes his image, but his color scheme is really beautiful. And in particular, I wanted to use this warmer color scheme in part to counter the kind of criticism that was always made about modernist architecture, that it was cold, it was sterile, it was inhuman. It's anything but that. And so I chose a warm tonality for the most part throughout to also convey this sense of romanticism that these modernist buildings do have. So here's my first photograph looking at the glass house from a distance, and the proportional system that I use, which I use a lot, is a 2x3 proportional scheme. And what this does is, here's the building, here's the tree and the other outbuilding. 2/5 of the way in is where I put the edge of my tree. And I have 3/5 of the building, 3/5 of the image is the architecture and the glass house. And also these other demarcations, that 1/5 of the way in sets the corner of the glass house. So this is very precisely laid out. Here's the corner of the brick house. There's a little space in between there, so there's a sense of depth. So I am using, and we'll see throughout, I am using this 2x3 proportional system throughout my photographic documentation of the glass house. Here's another one where I'm thinking again about Corot and also Claude Lorraine and their use of these really warm tonalities. Again, I am framing the glass house within the landscape framework. I've got a really early morning shot, so I have this nice chiaroscuro, light to dark, light to dark, light to dark, giving a lot of dimension. Also, and we'll see this in some others, the glass house sits on a slab. It is like a pavilion house. And so there's a light that is just hitting the edge of where the pavilion is. This is a view coming from the other side. And again, I'm using a 2x3 proportional system to set where I want to put these main trees. 2/5 of the way in is where the house is. 3/5 of the way in is where my path goes in, where this other sculptural element takes you into where the glass house is back there. We will get to it in a minute. Here is what, for many people, this is the signature shot of the glass house. We'll see later. I don't think this is the signature shot of the glass house because there is one aspect of it that isn't shown, and I think it is a particularly important aspect of this building. However, let's look at how this is being proportioned. What's critical is, this is a flat roof house obviously, is where you put the roof of the house in relationship to the rest of the image. And again, now I have taken my 2x3 proportional system and I've given the bottom 2/5 to the house and the top 3/5 to the landscape. Again, because the landscape was so important to Mr. Johnson in his citing. And so that's why I have set the roof of my house just 2/5 of the way, right to the top of the fireplace there. This is a view from the side, important because it shows not just the front, but it shows the depth of the house, which is in fact only 1 room thick. I mean, it's like this pavilion house. Now, here's the 2x3 proportional system. 2 key elements. One, the corner of the building. I've discussed this in some other videos that if you're going to shoot off axis, you don't want to put the corner of the building in the middle because that breaks the picture into 2, and in one sense it makes it static, and in the other sense your eye goes in one direction, your eye goes in another direction. It doesn't make for comfortable viewing. So I have put the corner of my building 2/5 of the way in, 3/5 is for the rest, and again I've set the top of the building at 2/5 of the way down, 3/5 of the way up, and everything else in here revolves around that proportional system. This for me has always been, for me, the signature view of the glass house. Why? Because the glass house sits on this raised site, which acts like a pedestal, and it gives the glass house this sculptural quality. It makes it almost a jewel within the landscape. And you need to see that it's set actually on elevation. You can see that I've shown you that the ground goes down here, and that the building is actually sitting up on, almost as if it's on a plinth. And again, I'm showing transparency, reflection. You can see in here. I've got a time of day when I've lit the edge of the support so that you don't miss it. This is a view from the other side, and again, clearly shows that the house is on a raised platform. So key elements here, I want to include this full height vertical to keep your eye on the frame. Absent a full height vertical, I've darkened the corner here. So the key is, where does the edge of the tree go? Where does the height of the building go? Where does the base of the building? I have backed up, shot this so that 1/5 of the way in is where I'm going to put my tree. 3/5 of the way up is where I put the roof of the building. 1/5 of the way up is where I put my the base, and approximately 1/5 of the way in is where I put the right-hand side of the building. So this all fits very tightly within this 2x3 proportional scheme. But if you look at the photograph, and don't look at this, you're not so aware of this proportional system, but it is there. Now we're going to go inside for a minute, and I want to take a moment to discuss the idea that I had for the tonality of the interiors. I'm looking at a painting here by De Hooch, and even though the things are a little off kilter, this is an axial composition typical of Dutch interior painting. There's a clear procession from near foreground, mid-foreground, mid-ground, and all the way to the background. Now, this vertical element on the left keeps your eye in. You're going in this direction. This stops your eye and turns it this way. And these vertical elements on the right also keep you in the frame, even though there's this little stairway that kind of wants your eye to go this way. These verticals keep you here. The last thing is, there's a really warm tonality here. And in general, I have stressed the fact that all things being equal, I prefer a warmer tonality over a cooler tonality, because we're humans and we respond to warm tones. And if you want to see the opposite of that, take a look at a few of the episodes of The Handmaid's Tale. It is so cyan looking, it looks like it was filmed through a NyQuil bottle. And there's a reason for that. That cyan is a very kind of dystopian color. It's not particularly attractive. So I've chosen to follow the lead of De Hooch when I do my interiors. So I photographed this at a time of day that does several things. One, this is one big room. There is this foreground area. There is this area back here, which is all rectilinear. And then there's this area to the right that's all curved. Here's the curved sculpture. Here's the fireplace and the curved and this big curved like barrels in the middle of it. So there are really 3 elements. And so in my proportional system, I have separated 2/5 of the way. That takes care of this. 2/5 of the way in takes care of the area where the curved elements are, and 3/5 where the rectilinear elements are, except for the fig tree. So that's what defines the basic areas of the room. Now let's look at a couple of things particularly. One, and I'm going to show you, I have my camera placed so that I have a couple of elements that overlap to give an additional sense of depth. If you again look at Vermeer, all the elements in Vermeer, they're either in front of one another or behind one another or separated. They're almost never tangential because there's no sense of depth here. If you have 2 elements and they're like this, there's a sense of depth. If you do it that way, there's a sense of depth. But if you line them up, there's no sense of depth. So to create just a hint of the sense of depth between this foreground and the background, I have let the top of my chair, this Bruno chair, just break the plane of the rug. Same thing over here on the right. I've let the sculpture just break the plane of this mullion to do exactly the same thing. I want to set that further forward from everything that's behind. And again, there are 2 areas to the room, the curved areas and the separate and the rectilinear areas. And so I've chosen a time of day when the light is coming in and it's not on the rug. It's only on the floor. It's only on the sculptural end of the building. And also I've chosen my eye height not only to just break the plane of the rug, but also if I'm seated down at eye height, you get a visitor's view of the room rather than standing up high shooting at 5.5 feet, 5, 6, which gives you foreground distortion, which I don't think works. My eye height is down to give a visitor's view and also to break the plane. This is a closer view of this area, and I've done the same thing. I've set the fireplace to 2/5, the rectilinear areas to 3/5, the height of the fireplace is at 1/5, the base of the chairs is at 1/5, the corner of the room is at approximately 1/5, the height of the room is 2/5 down. It's very important because otherwise the ceiling could get really powerful. There's nothing in there, it's completely unarticulated. So this thing could get really heavy. So that's why I've separated these various elements, again, according to this 2x3 proportion system. And then here's the other view going back where, again, I am emphasizing the view out. We're going to see this little outbuilding, which is a studio. But again, I have a time of day when I just have a little bit of chiaroscuro, a little bit of light on the shadows. I've got a little space in here to get your eye past the Barcelona couch and the edge of the table, and you get a view through. I've got verticals over here to keep your eye in. I'm on axis, and I'm up just high enough so that I can see all of the accessories on the table, and they break the plane of here, this Barcelona chair, again, to give that added little sense of depth. There are outbuildings on the site of the glass house that Mr. Johnson put in after the fact. And I wanted to show not just the buildings, but how they related to the main building, because Mr. Johnson, again, was so precise in his placement of everything. There's nothing that wasn't thought through perfectly. So there are 2 pieces of sculpture, and what I've shown here, this is my view showing that the glass house is sitting as a sculptural element. Here's the slope going down, and now I'm showing you what's happening down below. Here's this little folly, and then there's another sculpture piece back in the distance. So I'm showing you in this photograph not just these buildings, but how they relate to the main building. So this is a view of just the sculptural elements within the landscape. And as I've done before, I've kept all the sculptural elements 3/5 of the way 2/5 of the way is the rest of the landscape. And I've also taken the folly and I've placed it 2/5 of the way up, 3/5 of the way above is the landscape that's supporting it. This is the folly itself, and I want to show you something else about my little proportional scheme. If you have a 2x3 proportional system, it breaks down into 25 squares, and within that are 9 squares, and so I place the folly just within the center of all of this. Let's look at the studio. What I've done is set the studio in relationship to the brick building, which is on the other side of the glass house. So your eye enters here, turns this way. Now here's a really important element, and it's small, so I have to point it out. There is a little turn of the grass. If that's not there, your eye can go off the frame. And I've turned the landscape, turned the grass, so that when you take this little walkway with your eye, you don't go off frame, you turn back in, and I get you to where I want you to be, which is to look at this little studio in relationship to everything else. Here's the studio itself. Now I've done something that I ordinarily wouldn't do. Because it's small in the landscape, I've only given this 2/5 of the way in and let the landscape be 3/5 of the way in. I wanted the landscape to dominate this little building a bit more. This is a very tricky building. It's the sculptural studio. It's monochromatic. And so it's necessary when you shoot a monochromatic building to try to find the time of day when every single facade has its own tonality so that they don't run into one another. So you go from light to not as light, to dark, back to light, back to dark, all the way around the building. Now, this is a very complicated interior. So again, I am on axis. If you do a line through here, you'll see that I'm on axis. This is on axis. I am up a little higher than I normally would want to be because I need to see into this little space where the stairway is, but at least I have enough light and enough articulation on my shadows to separate these elements one from another. And yes, your eye does go back around, and I'm allowing you to do that. I'm not stopping your eye here because I want you to feel that this building takes you all the way outside. You walk through and walk around and you can see the landscape beyond. And the landscape is relating to everything else that goes on in the building. This is another view of it, and here I've been very careful to set this sculpture aside, 2/5 of the way in, 3/5 for the rest of it. Now, again, on axis, because this is a confusing shot, your eye goes here, goes around, comes up, comes over, comes back down, and it keep you working. Here's one piece of sculpture, here's another, and here's this wonderful building with all this articulation. And so all of the lines help move you through and don't let you escape, don't let you leave the frame. This is the opening to an underground painting gallery. And again, I have set this within my 9 square. It's on axis. I have a little bit of light on the handles so you know that this is a door. And the key is now, where do you place, again, how far up do you go with the ground plane and the sky and these trees? And again, it's 3/5 of the way up. That's where I put my line. 2/5 of the way is supporting material. And I've got a time of day when I have enough shadow in the foreground that here, like Cezanne, here's my little entrance way here where the light area is, takes you in, takes you to here, and now you're wondering what's going on in there. The doors aren't lit up. I'm thinking about De Chirico, who has these shadows that are completely without any information to make you wonder what's there. So here's the interior, and I purposely underlit this. I want to give this an underground, like a monastery. And so this is minimally lit, underexposed. I haven't hit the artwork with any extra light. I haven't, because I want this to have this kind of really quiet, monastic feel. Another building is this chain link building, and it's meant to be seen through. And so I took a time of day when the whole area was lit with dappled light. So it would usually dappled light everywhere is confusing to look at. And sometimes if you have a piece of architecture in an environment and you shoot it where there's dappled light, it's going to be sometimes difficult to see that. I wanted to make sure it would be difficult because that was the idea of this building. Depending on where you are and going around it, you see through it. Sometimes you see the structure, sometimes you don't. So I have this complicated image with complicated lighting that in a way is sympathetic to what the idea of this building was. And lastly is this sculptural form in the landscape. And there are a couple of things I've done here, again, that I don't ordinarily do. First of all, my camera is really low to the ground. And the reason that it's this low is I don't want to see where the building plane hits the ground plane. Normally you want to do that because it gives you your sense of scale. If you can't see the base of the building, you don't have the whole idea. But what I wanted to do here, and with my low camera angle and my light coming in, my wall coming in, leading you here, I want you to feel that this thing is growing out of the ground and that you don't actually see where it starts. But from here, this thing looks like it's just emerging. And again, each facade has its own degree of tonality so that you get a nice sense of volume. But everything leads, here's my vertical to keep you here, here's my darkened corner because there's no vertical over here to keep you within the picture frame. It's dark down here, here's my light like Cezanne leading you in, and then you have this odd form back here. And again, I'm low enough so you don't see where it hits the base. Let me go back now to what for me is the signature shot on the glass house, and I hope that this was of interest to you so that you have a sense of what I was thinking about as I was shooting it, and also what preparations I made beforehand in terms of the structure of my photographs before I even took the very first picture. I hope this was of interest to you. I enjoyed putting this together and going back over what I was thinking about before I actually did the photography, what I was looking at. If these videos are of value to you, I hope you will look at some of the others. I hope you'll subscribe. And if this information, again, has helped you in your work, please check my book at stephenbrookephotography.com. It's loaded with all kinds of information like this. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you again.